How's it going, world? It's the dishwasher. Right now, I'm getting ready for supper or dinner, if you don't know how to pronounce supper properly. Uh, that's kind of a joke going back to one of my favorite YouTube channels. Last week on Dylan Talks Tone, there was a robust discussion over whether it's called dinner or supper. And um, different English speaking people in different parts of the world call it one thing or another. Doesn't really matter. The American South traditionally calls the evening meal supper. But anyway, I am making, well, right now I'm prepping some Brussels sprouts, a food I did not like when I was growing up, but I do now. Um, Brussels sprouts have that weird thing about them that they've always been kind of the butt of a joke. Um, that kids didn't like them. I feel like if I had grown up eating Brussels sprouts from a very young age, I probably would have liked them just fine, because I liked things like collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, and there are adult humans to this day who don't like one or other of those greens because of the flavor they have. But I grew up liking all of them. So, one thing I wanted to talk about today is where my wife and daughter and I, mainly my wife and I, but also consequently my daughter and my wife, have chosen to live. First off, let me say I grew up in the city of Savannah, Georgia. Savannah is a port city on the east coast of the United States, founded in 1733 by mainly, specifically by a guy named James Oglethorpe, General James Oglethorpe. It's a British guy. Well, he's kind of British too. And Savannah, despite being a very traditional southern city, is also a port city. Several interesting, important, different, weird things about Savannah. Savannah was one of the first places in the United States to allow Jewish people into North America. 1732, Georgia was technically founded. 1733, people actually showed up, and possibly influenza, possibly something else, but some viral something arrived with the settlers, and they got sick, and then, not really out of the blue, but sorta, a shipload of Jewish people arrived from England. Now, these folk they weren't from England. They had been in England for about a year, and then they were sent on, kind of, to Georgia. Jews were not treated well in Europe. Well, they'd never been treated well in Europe, but they weren't, especially 300 years ago. But they were kind of sent on their way by the people of London. But they had been in London for a very important, very relevant outbreak of probably influenza. And when they arrived in Georgia, or what would become Georgia as we know it today, there were there was at least one Jewish doctor on board the ship. Jewish doctor, one doctor on this ship of Jewish people who recognized what was happening and offered to help. And General Oglethorpe said, "Please, by all means." And so this shipload of Jewish folk were welcomed. There's a marker on Oglethorpe Street. I've always called it a street, but it might be an avenue. In Savannah, commemorating the location of the first Jewish cemetery in Savannah. Savannah also was not necessarily adverse, or wasn't necessarily against Catholics. Catholicism was viewed by the British people, in general, non-Catholic Europeans as one of the great causes of badness, for lack of a better phrase. It's considered one of the great evils of the world in the 18th century. Not all Catholics, and not all the time. Obviously, Britain had been ruled by Catholic monarchs up until the coming of William and Mary. And, well, not exactly. Okay. You had the Protestant movement under Henry, and then the restoration of Catholicism under his daughter Mary, and then Elizabeth became queen, and Catholicism was sort of outlawed and banned in Great Britain. And when Britain became a colonial state, apart from the Irish colonialism it had already engaged in heavily, when it went outside of Europe as a colonial state, Catholicism was not encouraged and was often outright prohibited, proscribed. The wars and various rivalries with Spain, and Portugal, and France were seen by the British as a holy war in a small sense against what they would have called popery or papist beliefs. And so many colonies, apart from Maryland famously, did not allow Catholics to come to their new lands. Savannah allowed Catholics. Maybe not enthusiastically, but toleration, as it used to be called. Religious liberty being what we would come to know as a founding tenet and theoretically current strong point of the American political status quo. So Savannah, interesting town. In some ways a traditional sleepy southern town, in other ways not so much. But essentially, if you're going to do business, which is what a port city is all about, being picky about who you do business with is not usually a great policy. So, on the other hand, South Carolina had been established for a good nearly 100 years when Georgia was founded. South Carolinians wanted to move into Georgia, fresh territory for them to exploit, and they brought their slaves. Now, originally, slavery was outlawed in Georgia. Not outlawed, it was prohibited. Georgia was a little bit of a utopian experiment, early on. The notion being, we're talking about the Enlightenment here. As much as we like to talk about how the founding fathers of this country were slave owning, blah, 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 blah. Yes, that's true. But we're talking about an era when, for the first time in human history, on a grand scale in the West at least, people were starting to question things like, should we own other human beings? So that's a big deal. The Enlightenment was a big deal, even if it wasn't perfect. And when the men who decided to found Georgia brought the idea to the British government, they said, well, we'd like there not to be slavery, and we're going to allow people who might otherwise be in debtor's prison, which was a thing, going to jail because you owed people money, people who might be in debtor's prison, to have a fresh start here. There's a weird, persistent rumor that's been around my whole life that Georgia was a quote-unquote penal colony. Not really. Not like Australia. Australia was where the British, once they discovered it and started exploring it, was a true penal colony where especially Irish dissenters, resistors, basically anybody who resisted British rule in Ireland, they were sent to Australia as criminals. The people who went to Georgia in 1733 were not criminals as we would think of them today. If they were, literally half of American people in their current state of existence would be also considered criminals by the fact that they owed people money they couldn't repay right now. So Georgia was a colony founded with the idea of a fresh financial start. You might even call it, in some weird way, the most extreme form of bankruptcy court you could possibly imagine. Oh, you owe somebody a lot of money? Okay, get on the ship, go to a new continent, new to Europeans, and eventually your debt will be forgiven. So this is where I grew up, in this place of what we consider charming, amazing history today, but at the time was an experiment wrapped inside of idealism mixed with some interesting outside influence at times, from South Carolinians bringing their slaves into Georgia and clearing new lands and starting farms. You also had the Salzburgers, who were a group of German, Austrian dissenters who were essentially driven across Europe by the Austrian kingdom, empire, all the way across France until they reached Britain, and were sent, like the Jews, onto the New World because they were weird, different, didn't conform. And these were German, Austrian folks who set up a community on the Savannah River called Ebenezer. Ebenezer soon failed, and they founded New Ebenezer. But this place, Savannah, where I grew up, very interesting place, very different, very well established. It's been there since 1733. And I never imagined myself leaving that place, but I did. My wife, not from Savannah, she came to Savannah for college, to the Savannah College of Art and Design, where I met her when she was there, and eventually she needed to go home. So I followed her. We had been together for a couple of years, and she had to go home, and I came with her, so to speak. And then a weird thing happened. We had lived near Atlanta, which is the capital of Georgia, for a while. She grew up, about 50 miles from Atlanta, and We lived about 30 miles from Atlanta, and our daughter was born, and we both had jobs slash careers, and we were visiting our in-laws for New Year's over in the small town, well, near the small town where we live now, and I've always liked to kind of get away from that family environment a little bit on my own. Just I'm a pretty solitary person sometimes, and I came downtown to the town in which we now live around New Year's Day, early in the morning, well, probably 10, 11 o'clock. And I walked down the street and I thought, well, this is, I've driven through this town several times. I've been to it, sort of, a little bit. And I walked around and I looked at this one house in particular. It's not the house we live in, but this house, probably 100 yards off the road, and it had this Tudor Art Nouveau Deco weird thing going on, and I thought maybe we should live here. And then on the way home from the family gathering, next day, I said, I think we should move here. My wife said, oh, well, okay, why? Because moving to a tiny town was never exactly in the plan, but she was open to the idea. And so then we started looking at houses, and we started noticing that the prices were ridiculously low. This is 4 years ago. It's 2022 now, so this was 2018. No, I'm sorry, this was actually late 2017, first of 2018. Prices were insanely low, and we said, well, that's awesome. And then we started looking around for houses, looking on Zillow, and we took a little trip over. It was about an hour from our house to over here, and it's really weird how it happened. Walking down the street and thinking, what if we lived here? And then looking at houses and thinking, okay, we'll check out some of those houses. We drove over here, and then we looked at all the houses we picked out on Zillow that were for sale. And then we were driving down Main Street, and I said, what's down that way? And we took a left turn. Might have been a right turn. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. And we saw a real estate listing for a house that was not on our list. And I pulled into the driveway, which is behind me out this window, and the house is weird. It's a Victorian house, so you can't see in the windows from eye level, but we looked in the windows as much as we can, and we're like, we got to find this house. So we found the address, and we looked it up on Zillow, and we got in contact with the real estate agent. 4 years later, here we are. We've been here now for 4 years, 4.5 almost, and it's not Savannah. It's not Atlanta. It's not where we used to live. But it's pretty amazing. Probably need to wrap this up because I've got brownies in the oven. I've got to get these Brussels sprouts ready to cook, and also I'm making salmon patties, aka salmon croquettes. Anybody who doesn't know, in the South, salmon croquettes, despite us having no salmon anywhere nearby, is a major delicacy because back in the Depression, canned salmon started being shipped into the South to augment protein, and thus salmon patties, as my grandma always called them, are a big part of Southern cuisine. Probably they might be where you are too. I don't know, it's a big time thing in the South, but it could be a big time thing in other places. I don't know. I've traveled a lot of the world, but not everywhere. So anyway, I'm making salmon patties and Brussels sprouts and brownies in the oven. So that's the end of this video, and next time we'll talk more about moving to strange small towns far away from where you envisioned yourself when you were younger. Everybody have a good day.